It is a great gift to be here with you all, and especially to be here with Elaine, who I've also followed at a distance. And she married a physicist, I married a physicist, and so pretty much all of her experience trying to explain her husband's work is like my experience trying to explain my wife's work, which I have learned to not attempt very often. So some thoughts about our response as people who are going back out into churches and the world, having experienced what we have these past few days. It's one of the, I think, merciful mysteries of human cognition that we have no robust mechanism for remembering physical pain. We have no robust mechanism for remembering physical pain. I've had a few moments of intense physical pain in my life, even as a very fortunate and protected human being. And while I can call up quite vivid memories of all kinds of other senses, the time when I had sciatic pain down through my leg, originating in the sciatic nerve in my back, one of the most intense experiences of pain, I can remember that I felt pain. And I can sort of remember what it was like to have felt pain, but the pain itself is not accessible to me through memory. It's a great gift, I think, that our bodies allow us to forget their most excruciating moments physically. But wow, do we have mechanisms for remembering emotional pain. We do not remember physical pain, but wow, we remember the emotions of pain. Every negative thing said about us. Yesterday, Jim Stump was sharing a little bit about the work of BioLogos by way of setting up his talk, and he showed all those maps and all the countries of the world where people have come from, and even two in Greenland, and found BioLogos helpful. And we can assume that most of those people were, really grateful, and they kept clicking because they were getting things they needed from this extraordinary organization. And then he showed us two screenshots of two critical articles. And if Jim's cognition is anything like my cognition, he can quote you long passages by memory with no effort put into remembering them of those critical articles from both sides of this conflict. I've received, I'm an author, and part of what authors do, it's this sort of very awkward thing, is go around getting blurbs for our books. Through 4 books, I've probably accumulated 45 or 50 blurbs. I cannot quote one of them to you. All those positive things people said under pressure from our mutual agent or publisher or whatever. And I can quote you every syllable of any number of negative tweets, certain biting moments in reviews. County Cullen incident. Once, riding in old Baltimore, heart-filled, head-filled with glee, I saw a Baltimorean keep looking straight at me. Now, I was 8 and very small, and he was no whit bigger, and so I smiled. But he poked out his tongue and called me. I saw the whole of Baltimore from May until December of all the things that happened there. That's all that I remember. Elaine gave a very compelling and helpful presentation yesterday, but it left me with a really significant question. She kept giving us data that showed that, in fact, this idea that there's some entrenched conflict between science and religion it needs more nuance. And in fact, there's quite a spectrum of opinion, and much of it weights toward the positive, among both the religious towards science and among the scientists towards religion. And so it left me asking this question: why is it that the myth or the narrative or the vocabulary of conflict is so entrenched. And I think, Elaine, you used that phrase, and you said that what I'm studying is why is this myth so entrenched, this sort of metaphorical space of war so entrenched? Well, I think I might have a partial answer to your question. It's because conflict is one of the most cognitively salient aspects of human experience. Conflict persists in our memory because of pain, because of humiliation, because of scorn. What is the key moment in the story of American Christianity and Darwinian evolution? You might expect it was the moment when Asa Gray, the Christian scientist at Harvard University, recognized the brilliance of Darwin's core idea and began to defend it. But that's an endorsement. That's not what we remember. That's not what has shaped our imagination. No, it's the Scopes trial. And why do we remember the Scopes trial? Not because of the content of the Scopes trial or even the outcome of the Scopes trial. In fact, who even remembers that, in fact, the creationist side, represented by the school board of Dayton, won that trial? No one remembers even who won. What we remember is the conflict. And conservative Christians remember more than just that there was a conflict. We remember the scorn of Mencken's sarcastic coverage of the trial, the biting cynicism of Clarence Darrow, the lawyer for the defendant in the trial. And while I very much take your point, Josh, that there's a certain kind of person, a certain kind of phenotype, as you said, who cares so intensely about some of these issues, I do want to say it's partly because a certain kind of person was scorned at that moment very publicly and powerfully in American public life. And that entrenched in American imaginations, and especially in the imaginations of the children and grandchildren of the fundamentalists, those conservative Christians themselves, indeed white, who had fought that battle with that Pyrrhic victory. There's a reason this is so entrenched. And here's the thing, though. It's not just Christians who retain and remember every negative thing. It's also those on the other side. And my wife, who is a physicist teaching at a secular or pluralistic college, has colleagues who have stepped in from the side of science, doing their best to explain in good faith and with goodwill why we believe so robustly in certain features of human and cosmic origins, and who have gotten vicious responses from Christians that they talk about with a kind of bewildered hurt in the faculty lunchroom. I think this idea of conflict persists because of the cognitive salience of conflict on all sides. And this is the story we are going back into. BioLogos has been a great gift to the church because you sense in the people who lead this organization, Jeff and Deb and Daryl previously and many others, this incredible winsome openness. And I think we've experienced in these days together, we have not experienced, I hope, I haven't sensed it, those moments of pitched or intense or alienating scorn at all. It's an incredible gift. But how does this gift get taken back to a world that forgets anything but the most painful moments? Israel was surrounded by conflict. To some extent, this is the fate of all nations at all times, but Israel, as a small nation in a very geopolitically strategic location, from its inception, was surrounded by large empires, had to fight battles, itself fought battles to possess its land. And Israel was surrounded by conflict myths, by stories that actually explained why we see all the conflict around us by referring them to ultimate cosmic conflict. Many, if not all, of the creation myths that surrounded ancient Israel and the ancient Near East were what we call conflict cosmogonies. Accounts of creation that spoke of the world as coming into being through some divine conflict that then was ramified into a creation or simply a lower order, a terrestrial order, not itself a creation, that was often the byproduct of cosmic conflict, perhaps the most hilarious one being the account of the creation of human beings in the Enuma Elish over basically a problem among the gods in the heavens who like the smell of barbecue, but none of the gods want to keep the meat on the barbecue. So they're all lazy and frustrated with each other, and fights are breaking out among the gods. And so Marduk, the sort of demigod hero of the Enuma Elish, proposes to create little creatures down below who will keep the barbecues going, and so the smell of the barbecue will always waft up to the heavens. And so the purpose of human beings in that little corner of the Enuma Elish is to solve a divine conflict and provide for lazy, conflict-oriented gods. And it was in that context that Israel told its very different story. In the beginning, when God created the heavens and the earth was without form and void, and darkness was on the face of the deep, while, how shall we translate this? A spirit, a breath, a wind from God hovered over the waters. And in this beautiful, different story, there is no fundamental conflict. There's breath, there's waiting, there's speech, there's beholding, and then there's this drumbeat of affirmation. And God saw it was good. It was good. It was good. It's faintly terrifying to say anything about Genesis in a room that might have John Walton in it, or Tremper Longman in it, or many of the rest of you. But just to rehearse something that they know really well and all you know well, but just to call our attention to this narrative of goodness right in the midst of a political environment of conflict and a mythical sort of narrative structure of conflict, that this story tells something totally different. It speaks simply on days 1 through 3 of the merest act through speech of separation. God first separates the light and the dark on day 1. On day 2, God separates the heaven and the earth. And on day 3, God separates the sea from the land. Those are the first 3 days, and even those minimal structurings are seen by God as good. I'm so struck in our digital age when the most minimal unit of information, according to information theory, is a single bit, which is represented energetically by the presence or absence of a certain threshold of signal. 1 or 0, represented by signal or no signal, that the first thing God creates in this ancient story is signal and no signal. The first act of the word is to create the precondition of information, which is energy and its absence, light and dark, and even that is good. And then having the heavenly realm and the earthly realm is good, and having the sea and the land is good. 3 days of structure and order, and then, as you know, days 4, 5, and 6 go back, and each of them corresponds to their corresponding day 1, 2, 3, right? So day 4 is now a day when the realm of light and dark is going to be filled with creatures, the sun, the moon, and all the stars. Day 5 corresponds to day 2, and now the heavens and the watery terrestrial realm are going to begin to be filled with creatures, birds and fish and everything that swims in the sea. And then on day 6, the dry land having appeared on day 3, well, day 6 fills that dry land with creatures. And the word that comes up twice in those latter 3 days, the days of filling, is this word teeming or swarming. And I love it that that word is in Genesis 1. Because this God, this creative God, both delights in order and delights in swarming or teeming, delights in abundance. And once his world filled, not with a minimal specification of creatures, that would be like one big light in the day and a little light at night, sun and moon, and we're done. But instead, this God has strewn through the heavens, the visible heavens to human beings, uncountable stars. If you asked an ancient person how many of them are there, they might have said thousands or tens or hundreds of thousands, maybe a million. And of course, thanks to astronomers like Deb and Jennifer and others, we know it's not millions, it's what you can see, if you could see deep and far enough in, would be billions of galaxies, which have billions of stars. That God doesn't just want a few creatures, he wants teeming stars. Teeming birds, teeming fish. Every once in a while, human beings get to see this. Let me just show you. Every once in a while, we get to see this. Let me show you what we see. This is a little video made by a couple of millennials. So they came home and put a soundtrack to it and put it on YouTube. So you'll just see what they saw. We will need the soundtrack. Do we not have it? Collection of starlings is called a murmuration. Liberty Smith and Sophie Windsor-Clive happened to be in the right place at the right time and saw with beautiful order astonishing abundance that even prompts a word that we don't usually use at BioLogos events, but that's just what pops out in the presence of that kind of teeming. This is the world God makes, and of course, there's even this kind of teeming abundance, surprise in the poem itself, because on day 6, having filled the land with creeping creatures, you would think God's done and it's going to be one more day of goodness, but of course, there's this bonus round of creation on day 6, in which creatures are made in the image of God, male and female, able to make videos like that, able to attend to the world with awe and unforced profanity in worship. And God says, now you team. And they themselves have their own order, by the way, their own structure, their binary structure of male and female, which we know now has a kind of referent to the digital information of DNA encoded in pairs, strands, and then a strand contributed by each of male and female that produces not a clone of a parent, but a new person, teeming. If you doubt it, if you have children or have brothers and sisters, look at your own family. We're not little copies. That beautiful basic structure of male and female generates what God commands: be fruitful, fill the earth, multiply. Some of you know I've been sort of on a 2x2 kick for the past few years, and it occurred to me we could do this with Genesis 1. Order and abundance, that's the recipe for a very good creation. And this actually allows us to play this out and see one important thing that I want to call your attention to, and then just make a few comments about its implications for what we do next. If you have neither order nor abundance, you have the nothing that Genesis says was present at the beginning. The earth was without form and void. no structure, no filling. If you have abundance without order, over to the right on this graph, you have my daughter's bedroom. My 16-year-old daughter has an abundance of clothing on her floor, but there is no evident structure to it. It's chaos. But then what if you had order without abundance? What if you had lots of structure, lots of rules, but no teaming? I suppose you would have what we might call a machine. Now here is the fascinating thing. This is what Enlightenment science thought the universe was. This is what early modern, or we might say modern proper science, distinguishing it from 20th and 21st century science. This is what we thought the world was, a machine. It had natural laws. It had particles that obeyed those natural laws with perfect regularity, lots of structure, beautifully mathematically renderable and describable, but completely locked into that structure, fixed in origin and outcome. And then along came the 20th century, above all quantum mechanics, and we discovered that if you go down to the fundamental layer of reality, you cannot describe it in terms of particles obeying laws. The only way you can describe the fundamental reality, as best as we know right now at least, is through possibility expressed in probability. We cannot characterize our world as a machine. It's not a clock. A clock just ticks along if it's a good clock with perfect regularity. No surprise, no variance, no possibility, no randomness or stochasticity. And that is not our world. And it's not Genesis's world. So if you wanted to be a satisfied atheist, I submit the best time was about 1890, and it's been downhill ever since. Because actually we live in a world that does, yes, have beautiful order and has this extraordinary capacity to generate abundance, as in the murmuration of starlings, that can be described through certain kinds of beautiful probabilistic equations and models, but ultimately is teeming beyond any mechanical ability to describe it, and is far more beautiful, and indeed, I think we want to say as Christians, far more worthy of provoking worship. What is the good news we offer the world? Well, I have a series of ideas here that I'm going to do very quickly. Number one, the world is not a machine. This is actually incredibly good news. The world is full of order and structure, but it's also full of unpredictable, manifold variety. And the Christian creation story actually maps on to this world we're in that is no mere mechanism, but is very fundamentally characterized by what we might call life, which is ordered abundance. But also, science is not a machine. The work of science is not mechanical. It's not a mechanical method for churning out objective facts about the world. Instead, science is a profoundly human enterprise and profoundly cosmic enterprise with all the glories and unpredictabilities of human life and the cosmos we inhabit. And this is more true the more complex the system science tries to characterize. So that when we abstract away from this ordered, abundant world, we can create very, very simple scientific models that are indeed very close to mechanical. But the more complex the system we try to address, the less science is like that. Good science is less like that. And of course, the most complex system we know of in the universe is a human person, or maybe a whole group of human persons. And when we try to speak scientifically about that, it's much harder. There's this movement in science now, in the social sciences, to pre-register hypotheses. That is, when you're about to do an experiment, how about if you just write down ahead of time and put it in a database what you think your experiment is going to show or your project is going to show. Before this movement took off, 57% of hypotheses were borne out by social science and psychological science experiments. That's pretty good. Almost 60% of the time we get it right. When you ask psychologists and sociologists to pre-register their hypothesis, to say what they think they're going to find, and then they go do the experiment, the number of hypotheses that turn out to be correct is 8%. From 57%, hey, we're doing pretty good. We pretty much got this human stuff figured out, to, oh, no, that's what's called p-hacking. It's doing the data, doing the research, getting the data, and then being like, oh, I think I see a pattern. I think that's my hypothesis. We know so little. We don't even know that much about the cosmic world. The large-scale cosmology questions are much less reproducible than we'd like to think. There's this beautiful video from 2014 of the Stanford theoretical physicist Andre Linde being visited by some experimentalists who have just confirmed Andre Linde's life work by measuring the bipolarization of the cosmic microwave background. And there's this crucial moment in this video where they're popping open the champagne, and this elderly man is seeing that actually experimentalists have finally confirmed what he believed to be true all along, where he asks them how significant the result is, and they say, we have 7 sigmas of significance. In physics, the gold standard is 5 sigmas, 5 standard deviations. It's got to be true. We've got 7. 6 months later, that result from the BICEP2 apparatus was disconfirmed by the Planck collaboration that found that they were just pointing their apparatus at a particularly propitious part of the cosmic background. Do you know what I learned from being married to a scientist that science is like? It's really humbling because most of the time you're wrong. It's not a machine. That doesn't mean it doesn't tell us truth about the world. It just means it's not a mechanism. It's better than that. Our doctrine is not a machine. Christian doctrine is not a set of rules that rigidly, repeatably generate exactly the same results in every time and every place. Of course, we have powerful evidence for God as known in Christ. But we are still learning, and we should be learning. We don't have a mechanical doctrinal system, and we should not if God is a living God. Because machines, as Dorothy Sayers put it, are dead. They're fixed. But God is not the God of the dead. He's the God of the living. And people are definitely not machines. Above all, the most exemplary human being was not a machine. He's living word. He never answered a question the same way twice. He probably never told a parable the same way twice. This is a plausible reason we have different versions of his parables, because Jesus was not mechanical. He didn't figure out, oh, that's the thing that works, and just do it over and over, the way I, as a public speaker, am tempted to do. Instead, he was utterly attentive to every moment, and with beautiful order, every moment of his life teemed with unpredictable possibility. All right, briefly. Why do speakers say that? It is of no use for me to say briefly, and you know it's usually not going to happen. And I'm really just saying it for nervous David sitting in the front row. How are we going to take this story out into the world? Well, let me just say 2 things I want us to pray that we might do. As we go out into this world of conflict with this incredibly beautiful story, may I suggest we must do everything we can to avoid scorn and instead embody its reverse, which is compassion. A pastor told me with much chagrin about inviting a noted scientist in his congregation up onto stage to talk about his scientific work. And the scientist, who had lots to share and is a good Christian person, got very heated and began to talk about climate change deniers. The problem with that word denier, and by the way, I do not deny any of the following 3 things, that the climate is changing, that human beings are involved, and that certain political and economic adjustments are needed. I don't deny any of that. But the problem with using that word is it's a scornful word. And the pastor told me about all the damage control he had to do in the days following this interview could we instead be compassionate on those whose resistance to what we believe is very likely to be the deliverances of science is deeply rooted in their own experience of scorn, in their own fear, in their own doubts, in their own convictions? And then the other thing I think we need to learn, it might be even more important than compassion, is contemplation. Contemplation. What is contemplation? It's actually just beholding for the sake of beholding. I was really troubled by something in Elaine's statistics, and she found a good way to spin it, but I think it's troubling. It's that when you ask our tribe of evangelical Protestants, are you very interested in scientific discovery? 22% say yes. And when you ask them, are you very interested in medical discovery? I think it was 37% say yes. And the spin on that was, well, we are compassionate people. We want to see the results of science in the world and in the needs, the very vulnerable needs of human beings. I get that. But my concern is that this lack of interest in merely discovering and beholding God's world, and our belief that actually science is only interesting to us and valuable to us insofar as it solves human problems, actually leaves us extremely vulnerable to utilitarian arguments that will be put forth for certain applications of science that actually could be quite subtly but powerfully exploitative of the vulnerable. Will Christians be wise enough to recognize that mechanical attempts to fix human problems sometimes undermine human dignity? If we're told that cloning human beings would relieve profound human suffering, how quickly would many Christians get over that initial yuck factor and decide, well, I guess if it helps people, it's okay? Rather than having a deeper narrative that says, no, there's something about the abundance of sexual reproduction, human beings, male and female, the unpredictable, uncontrollable, non-mechanical begetting, not making of persons. Will we have the resources to respond in that way? There's a lot said about STEM in our world right now. Science, technology, engineering, maths. But the truth is, all our world actually wants is T. We don't actually want math just for the glory of human beings creating Hilbert spaces just out of our imagination if we're named Hilbert. And just glorying in how beautiful that is. Or we don't just want science, basic science that simply attends to the world. We want M to give us S, which will give us E, engineers, and the engineers are going to give us T, and T solves our problems. But maybe the most powerful thing I've ever heard from a Christian teacher was from the teacher of the spiritual life, Leanne Payne, who said once in my hearing, we either contemplate or we exploit. Will Christians simply be lining up with the rest of our culture to use the world for our ends as best we understand them? Or will we be the ones who say, no, M is good on its own. S is good on its own. Contemplating the world is good because this is what God is like. God is not a machine. God is not there to be used. God is to be enjoyed. And ultimately, this question of whether we can pastor our fellow Christians into both compassion and contemplation goes to the heart of our worship. Do we worship God because we hope to get something from God? Do we worship God thinking God's a machine to deliver us what we need? Or do we worship God because He has made all this and it is just very good to be creatures in His creation and be endowed with the gifts to reflect back to Him His goodness? That, it seems to me, is the challenge and the very good news that we could take from here into the world. Thank you.